Thanks for coming in. This is a kind of a redux of something that I did a few years ago around Hyper-V and System Center. How good can it be? And really that had a little bit more meaning back in 2009 when we did the first edition of this, because Hyper-V was fairly new. It was kind of coming up strong, building a good feature set. And it was kind of I tried to keep it as agnostic as possible. So it's not this is not meant to be hey, Hyper-V is awesome, you guys should proliferate it everywhere, it's great. VMware is a fantastic product. I have a lot of background on both technologies, but having a deep role these days in an organization that's heavy on customer facing and helping clients kind of absorb technology to solve problems, we're always looking for ways to either cut costs or do things with, do more with less, help clients understand what's out there and what's the reality of things. So this is part two. So here we're going to not chug a lot of Kool-Aid necessarily, although he would like you to. The last time I did this, I kind of presented this as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll give you my clear take on that. We have a lot of stick time with Hyper-V out there in production and semi-large scale deployments. One of the things I'll help you guys understand is some of the things that Microsoft touts out there in terms of product features, capabilities, second coming, don't necessarily wash out the way you would expect them in the real world. We've seen some chinks in the armor. Doesn't mean that it's not a good product, but you have to always take what you're being fed from vendors with a grain of salt. So a couple things. I am a consultant at heart. I don't work for Microsoft, obviously. I work for an organization that's partnered with Microsoft. But I come with a very deep VMware background. I've been involved in virtualization since 2005, ESX2X and forward. So I've seen that product evolve. I've also been around for the first inception of virtualization on the Microsoft front when they bought Connectix and then expanded that into virtual server and eventually came out with Hyper-V. And we've kind of followed the product along and watched it evolve. So we've lived through all the bumps, we've lived through all the mud that's gotten tossed at it, and rightfully so in many cases, but it's definitely coming along. One of the things that a guiding principle of any consultant or anybody who's trying to help someone understand what a technology is really to look at things from a requirements perspective. The feature war is always ongoing, and we're at the point now with 2012 and 2012 R2 where Microsoft is even starting to trump capabilities of VMware. But as you'll see on some of the things that I'm going to throw up here in terms of the bake-off of what they each do, some of it's irrelevant, some of it's wow, that's awesome, but who cares? Because the reality of it is a feature that is in a product that you don't need is completely irrelevant to you. So always look at things from what do I need to get done, what do I need to do, designed by requirements and not features. And then one of the other things that VMware is so proliferated out there, we see a lot of resistance from the technical folks, right? We're technical guys. We love cool technology. There's people in the office, the C-level offices that really care about the bottom line. And to them, features are awesome, but the reality is, do you need all of that? Do you need a Ferrari, or can you get by with a lower cost, fast automobile? Do you need all the features and bells and whistles? So one of the things that we encounter with them is as they're kind of going through the learning phase, they're like, it's different. I don't necessarily know about this. I don't like the way that works. Keep your mind open in terms of when you're using Hyper-V, you're using the System Center tools. Different doesn't necessarily mean better or worse or more complicated. It really just means that it's a different way to do things. So story continues. Part one was done back in 2009. And we actually did this, it was in July, it was in BriForum in Chicago over in the Hilton. And it was, I think it was just prior to the R2 release of Hyper-V. It was like right on the cusp, because I went back and I looked in the old slide deck, and there was some information in there about dynamic memory coming really soon. So it kind of led me to believe that most of what we had talked about was prior to R2. R2 really put a lot of great features out there for that. But a lot of time has passed. 2009 to 2013 is 4 years. It's a lifetime in IT, beyond a lifetime, multiple lifetimes. So hopefully the product has really come along. And really we asked a simple question, and it's been a guiding principle of Microsoft for a very long time, which is simply, is it good enough to get the job done? Microsoft has never been a pioneer in technology. They've always been a follower in technology. We always kind of look at them in terms of like the giant battleship. They're not very nimble in the water, but when they put their mind to something and they want to tackle it, and they get that battleship turning, and they set their guns on something, they can definitely make some headway in that. Back then, the question was, as it stood at that time, was it good enough to start leveraging this in a real environment, or is it still too, missing too many things? And really, it was an open question we tossed out there, and the feedback was mixed. Some people said yes, some people said no. Really, only you guys can answer whether it's appropriate or not. So, little history. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Microsoft's been involved in virtualization for a long time. Of course, everybody jumped on the bandwagon with virtualization and said now Citrix is virtualization. But basically, they made an acquisition of Connectix back in 2003, which was a competitor to VMware Workstation. Microsoft saw these cool things happening. They bought somebody, came out with Virtual PC, which is a proverbial piece of garbage. Came out with Virtual Server, which the first version was a piece of garbage. Version 2 wasn't too bad, but at that point, VMware had trumped them with a Type 1 hypervisor and was getting a lot more performance out of it. So everybody kind of chuckled and giggled over Virtual Server and didn't really do anything with it. Hyper-V first version came out in 2008. It was heralded as wow, look at us, we got a Type 1 hypervisor. Had some good capabilities and a lot of skeletons in the closet in terms of capability. A lot of that stuff was remediated in R2. R2 SP1 came out, gave us some new features and capabilities. 2012 really turned the corner for them in terms of feature sets. And then you'll notice a big gap, 5-ish months between Server 2012, System Center 2012, R2, SP1. And that's because they were on a differential release schedule. And this actually hurt them a lot because System Center 2012 came out in April of 2012. And then Hyper-V came out in 2012 of August, and then you couldn't manage it with System Center because it was a new operating system. So you had to wait 5 or 6 months for SP1 to come out to then start being able to manage it. So what happened is people got, oh, it's awesome, we got 2012, now we got new features, new capabilities. We can't manage it centrally because none of the System Center products are compatible yet. Since then, Microsoft has aligned all of their release schedules. So when you see R2 come out in a few months, probably even less than that, when that gets released, System Center R2 is coming out the exact same day. All the release schedules have been aligned so that the management products and the infrastructure are at the same time. So they're learning, a little at a time. So why Hyper-V? There were no cats harmed in this photo. And by the way, this is why 4G sucks, because these photos get flown all over the place on Twitter. Why Hyper-V? You guys, who in here is looking at Hyper-V? First of all, who's a solid VMware shop? Cool. Who's looking at Hyper-V? What was that? Who has Hyper-V now? Excellent. That's good. What was that? Anybody got both? We deploy all three. Excellent. That's where people are trying to get to. Number one reason why people are trying to do it is because they need more than one answer. Having one solution kind of backs you into a corner in terms of leverage. VMware is proliferated all over the place. But as somebody who's lived in VMware partners in terms of selling and deploying the product, we've seen an evolution in VMware. The company itself has become a little bit arrogant. They've lost their way in terms of their core virtualization capabilities, and rightfully so. They're expanding into other things. But the feedback we get from clients is that they feel backed into a corner because they own these ELAs, they own all this infrastructure and this software, and when it comes time to renew, they really have no recourse whatsoever because we own it, we implemented it, we don't have an alternative, and they're telling us your time is up, you got to renew, or you're gonna start to lose capabilities and future releases and things. So they feel backed into a corner. Cost is chained right onto that because when they're backed into a corner, they have no bargaining capabilities with an organization like VMware. So people are saying, I want alternatives. And that's where Hyper-V comes in. Disenfranchised people, not feeling so much love from them. Back in the day, man, VMware was in there taking you out to lunch and buying you all kinds of stuff and giving you swag. Now they disappear, and 6 months before your renewal comes up, they're on you, and then as soon as you sign the paper, they disappear. My experience, totally editorial, I'm not trying to say that companies one way or another. So top contenders. These guys will toss mud at each other all day long. I'm a consultant. I'm an integrator. One of the things I always try to get people to do is don't listen to the vendors, because whatever the vendor is, whoever it is, whatever technologies you're looking at, they're going to tell you their stuff is awesome and the other thing sucks. So no matter who you listen to, they all just toss mud back and forth. The reality is you guys got to do your own evaluation. You got to look at what you're trying to do. Does it stack up? Is it capable? Is there somebody else already doing it similar to me and they're getting success or failure or whatever it is? Get that kind of feedback. Don't necessarily listen to the vendors, because these guys will sling mud at them all day long. However, they are pretty much the top two contenders in the virtualization world today. There's a lot popping up, but they're kind of in different parts of the Gartner Magic Quadrant. So this is the latest one that was released a month and a half ago. And previously, Microsoft was kind of tucked down here. They were in the fourth quadrant up there, the Magic Quadrant, but they've, since 2012 release, they've slid up. It's good, right? Competitiveness and advances in feature sets breeds good for everybody. So they've gotten there. Microsoft is closing the gap. IDC, Hyper-V virtualization, second quarter of 2012, according to the research that they did, has become the market leader in 11 different countries. Turkey was one of them. I'd probably assume that a lot of the other ones are smaller countries that you probably won't hear much about. I do know for a fact, though, that in Japan, Hyper-V has surpassed VMware saturation.
What about U.S. market? They do a study on U.S. market?
They did, and they're not doing as well. Actually, the U.S. is the worst performing saturation for it. And probably because of VMware spends tons of money marketing here, and so. So let's get on to it. So here we're going to kind of compare what's the old Hyper-V of old and Hyper-V of new. And my old is comparing what we talked about in 2009 and where they've come. And then I'm going to show you where VMware is at in terms of their latest release 5.1. I'm not really following VMware terribly in terms of their future release, so I don't know what's happening in 6. I know that there's some stuff boiling for that. But this is as of current release. So back when we talked about it, we had, lackluster, it wasn't so bad. Logical processors supported by the host, 64, terabyte of memory addressable by the hypervisor. You could get up to 4 CPUs, 64 gigs of RAM per VM. Get a lot of VMs into a single host. Clustering wasn't too bad, but they've really bumped those numbers in 2012. They've made substantial advances in this. And the reality of this is that the numbers that you see here, and I suspect that VMware is probably very similar, 4 terabytes of RAM, that number changed a couple of times through the release cycle of 2012. So when it hit beta, it was one number. When it hit RC, it was 2 terabytes. And when it hit final RTM, they said we could do 4 terabytes. That was simply because they could get hardware that had that much capability in it to test. Because they can't say we can do 4 terabytes if they don't have physical hardware to actually do the testing against. So these numbers are based against what they could actually generate. 8,000 VMs per cluster, and when you look at what VMware does, there's some differentials there. Memory is a little shy, logical processors in the hardware, but
That also means that Microsoft will actually support all that. I mean, if you actually
yes.
add a host with that.
They will support you. Yeah, so the question was, does that mean that that's what Microsoft will support? And that is absolutely it. The word support means a lot of things to different people. To Microsoft, it means one thing. If they say they support it, when you call for help, they won't hang up on you. If they say it's unsupported, that means they will probably try to help you out, but at some point they'll say, you know what, this is an unsupported configuration. Repeat it on something that is supported, and then we'll help you if the same problem arises. But that's what support means to them. Supported means they will follow you to the grave on that problem to resolve it. Same thing with VMware. So that's what they mean. But the thing I'll say about this is, this is great. And look, Microsoft loves to tout this, and they put green on their side, and they start flashing the lower things on the VMware side with red. But the reality of it is, who's building servers in their environment with 2 terabytes of RAM? We're seeing 512 as kind of the norm. 768 is starting to creep in there, but we're not getting near these numbers yet. So the same thing I said in 2009 about these numbers, saying, On the Microsoft side, who cares that they're lower because you're really going to build anything at capacity? The reality still stands. So the only thing to really take away from this is that they've increased the capabilities of the hypervisor that it can play in the big leagues. But beyond that, who cares? It's great that I could build, I can get 512 virtual machines on a single host. That's a massive loss threshold when that thing pops for some reason and I need to recover those VMs.
I do think the 64 number for the maximum cluster nodes is significant.
It is. And it's funny. Yeah, and it's funny you say that because if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, nobody's doing that. We're seeing 8, 10, 12 max on the cluster size. But there was a stigma from the VMware world about maximum cluster size and the maximum number of hosts you could have accessing a VMFS at the same time. So that's kind of shoehorned that mentality of that. But we are absolutely seeing in the 30s, clusters of in the 30s.
Just to elaborate on why cluster sizes being bigger now, what's the biggest difference?
There's no need to sandbox them. In the previous days, you would, there was a functional limitation. So you actually had some problems if you had too many hosts accessing the same LUNs. SANs have gotten better, the software's gotten better, you don't really have that kind of a situation. Why bigger? Because you don't necessarily have the reasons that you have to sandbox it. When you put your mindset in cloud is who cares what's riding behind it? If I can manage the SLA of the individual workloads or groups of workloads, that's what I really need to worry about. I don't need to worry about how much CPU horsepower is in a bucket, how much memory is in the bucket. I need to worry about the consumption of that resource and managing the consumption of that resource. So
It was always the shared storage, not the hosts themselves.
right, yeah. And now that you're starting to even break those barriers with NFS, SMB3, we'll talk about that. But even the SANs, back in 2009, people were still taking SANs and carving up a certain number of LUNs into a certain type of a RAID array to get a certain throughput. SANs are just disks. It's just massive amounts of disks, and now they have SSDs, and they're migrating data blocks based upon usage, and there's so much going on at the storage level that it's changed. From a storage capabilities, they've really come a long way. They really only had third-party MPIO. They had native 4K disk support. It's not bad. Nice feature. Virtual disk size was 2 terabytes. We still don't see a whole lot of VHDs growing that big. I didn't have a number for the maximum pass-through disk size. I don't think it was actually limited. I think it was limited to 64 terabytes. But a lot of these things are new features. One of the biggest sticklers that we had in the Hyper-V world was storage live migration, the lack of it. Because prior to 2012, if you wanted to move the storage files of a VM around, the VM had to go offline, had to be suspended briefly while it did the change. And the problem that they had wasn't with the storage migration, it was with the snapshot capabilities. In Hyper-V, prior to 2012, if you snapshotted a virtual machine, when you went in, you said, delete my snapshot. In the interface, it went away, but that VHD continued to live and grow on the disk until you power cycled that VM. You either suspended it or you turned it off. And that led to a lot of problems.
Watch for the AVHD files to disappear.
Yeah, and exactly. Make sure that they go away. Because sometimes you'd lose your record in your XML, but you'd have an AVHD still stuck there in the chain. Yeah, so, and that was a problem. And you know how snapshots are. It's easy to create a snapshot, and then suddenly a week later you realize, oh, I didn't mean to put that there. Now you have to take your VM offline for an hour for it to churn that redo back into the original disk. This was a showstopper for a lot of people. And we also found a lot of people using storage live migration in the VMware world a lot. So this was probably the biggest nail, the biggest thorn that Microsoft had to deal with. They finally overcame it in 2012. And one of the things that they also did, live migrations. Prior to 2012, live migrations in Hyper-V could only happen one-to-one. Could only do one at a time. So if you wanted to move a boatload of VMs from one host to another, you had to pick them off one at a time and move them. You couldn't simultaneously move a bunch of VMs at the same time. And VMware loved to pound it home. The reality of it is now, as you look at this, and there's no limitations on some of these migration capabilities. We'll get to the live migration later, but again, I look at this and go, who cares about native 4K disk support at this point? I don't think it's a big deal. We haven't seen anybody practicing encrypted storage volumes. The promise is kind of nice, but I'm a little bit weary of encryption on the desktop side. I'm not sure I'm totally sold on it on the data center side, considering everything's under lock and key anyway. From a networking standpoint, they've come a long way, and they've completely polluted things along the way. Anybody using 2012? Anybody using Server 2012 Hyper-V and VMM 2012? Just installed it? Cool. How's the networking?
I like the teaming a lot, but I hate how SCVMM does the whole.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at is the networking in VMM. Here's what happened with that, and this came unofficially through the channels. Essentially, what happened is VMM 2008 or 2012 was released in April of last year, prior to Server 2012. So they tried to evolve the networking capabilities in VMM 2012 to manage Server Hyper-V R2. So they put some new things in the capabilities of the networking. 2012 came along and introduced all this new functionality: extensible virtual switch, virtualized networking, all kinds of new capabilities. Well, instead of going back to the drawing board when SP1 came out, they said, well, we need to put in the things that are appropriate for this, the port groups and all these other things into the management, but we need to preserve what's already there for all the folks that are running R2. So you ended up with a laundry list of things that you either used one piece of it or the other part of it, but really not both, and it was completely convoluted. It's nice to say in R2, 2012 R2, they did clean all that up. So, but yeah, that was a mess. But you know, lots of new capabilities that have come out along the way. And from the vSphere perspective, there's lots of other things: network virtualization, sandboxing, isolation. They sort of do this. You really need to get into the cloud products in order to get some of these capabilities that they do native in the box of 2012 these days. And you'll actually see that a lot. I'm covering things that are mostly in our 2012 Hyper-V, and some of it spills over into things that you may require VMM to do. But the reality of it is if you look at the stack of System Center 2012 managing Hyper-V in terms of a cloud infrastructure, you get a lot of capabilities out of the box in that you have to move up to VMware's cloud suites, which are a lot more money to get those capabilities. Extensible virtual switch. This is probably the only thing that I'll focus on here. They have what they call an extensible virtual switch, but they took a different route. VMware's route is to replace the virtual switch with something else, a Nexus or another third-party switch, completely replace it out of the hypervisor. With Hyper-V, they actually took a modular approach and said, well, you may want the network filtering module in the virtual switch to be replaced by somebody else's vendor, but you may want the Nexus in there for your ACL controls. You don't want to have to make a choice between I need this or I need that. You can actually slip in individual pieces without affecting the other ones that are in the stack. To this date, we have nobody using any third-party pieces in here. So again, great feature, that's really cool. Not a whole lot of activity there just yet. Management capabilities, live migration, simultaneous live migrations, they went to unlimited. Unlimited just means they don't have a maximum. They could cram as many down the wire as you have. You're limited by the size of your pipe. And if you have a pipe this big, I can either get one down really fast or 4 down at 25% the speed. They added dynamic optimization. This was a big thing. So in 2009, back in the early days, you guys ever hear like SCOM is the answer for monitoring? Why use anything else to do the monitoring? They got beat up pretty bad on this. And what they did is they moved the DRS capabilities right into VMM without having to have SCOM as an outboard monitoring piece. It's still there to do all of the history reporting and the health and the metrics and putting everything into a data library for future use, just like VCOPS does. But the day-to-day DRS, you really don't need a whole lot of activity. The promise that they had on this was, wouldn't it be great if you could have SCOM monitor the SLA of a database and then tell VMM, I'm not meeting the SLA, move the VM to another host that can. And that was the promise of it, being able to look all the way into the applications and make choices at the virtualization infrastructure level based upon what the applications are doing. The reality of it is all those vendors that wrote the management packs are going to be forced to go back and rewrite those packs to understand that logic, and nobody did. because nobody cares at that point. So Microsoft said, that's cool. We'll build dynamic optimization into the product. It works exactly the way DRS does. And funny enough, when you look at the interface, they have a 5-point slider for the aggressiveness, except theirs is vertical instead of horizontal. It's like McDowell's instead of McDonald's. Live migration, HA, fault tolerance. They still don't do VM fault tolerance, which VMware does. But I don't think that that's really still a valid feature anyway. I'm actually disappointed in that one from VMware because I would have thought that in the releases that they've had with FT, they would have evolved that feature. And it's gone nowhere. So.
How well does the dynamic optimization work?
It actually works very well. Yeah, we've done testing with it, and it works exactly as advertised. It seems to pinpoint more on CPU and memory than anything else, even though you have network and I/O controls in there. The confusing thing is you have to tweak it, and this is the difference between VMware's approach is it's all black box. You've got a slider there that says I want to do more or less, and that's about it. What it's choosing about more or less is kind of all behind the scenes, and you really don't have access into what's going on. In dynamic optimization, you've actually got tuning parameters of what do I consider CPU for optimization and memory for optimization. But the wording that they put in there and what you have to put in the interface is a little bit confusing because you have to calculate where you want those numbers to be ultimate violations. And if you have servers that are differing or you've got 128 gigs of RAM in there and it says, I'll wait till I only have 3 gigs of RAM left to make ultimate decisions. Yeah, it's like, if I'm at that point, I have big problems already. I need to tune those numbers. So we usually go in and do a calculation, like throw it at like 80%, whatever that threshold is, put that number in there and let it tune. The reality of it is, even when those numbers are way off, it still balances things around. But it's not unusual to see the balance look like this, because as long as this is still got enough headroom to be okay, there's no need to move stuff around. And if you push the aggressiveness over, it'll definitely do it more and do it less. But it just does live migrations. It seems to work just as well. That's about it for that. Some cool things in VMM 2012 that have come along. They do cross-platform management. I used to think that this was really cool, and I've now moved this to the ugly list. It's great that they can manage VMware vSphere 5, 4, and 3. They finally do all of the releases. They were always a release behind VMware, meaning when 2012 came out for System Center, you could only manage vSphere 4 and 3 and not 5 because you had to wait for SP1 to come out to get 5. They can do Xen Server. We don't see anybody using Xen Server except in some Citrix environments. You guys are, though, right? Citrix?
I'm a Citrix engineer, so by that I install Xen Server all the time.
Yeah.
Not anymore though with the open source. I think with open sourcing Xen Server, I think some of that's going to change to Hyper-V.
Yeah, just from that idea of that. The library management is pretty cool. You do template management, P2V integrated, server app V. Anybody play with that? We've played with it. We've got nobody who's willing to try it for real, but the promise is interesting. So you can sequence applications at the server level and deploy them very quickly. I don't know if you've looked if you haven't checked out what they do in 2012 in terms of templating, you should definitely do it because it's light years ahead of what VMware is doing. VMware's templating capability is basically take a VM and be able to just churn repeated copies, and maybe you could tune the hardware capabilities of it. In Hyper-V, you can actually say, I want to deploy a domain controller. I want to deploy a web server. You can actually have it install services on the fly while it's doing the deployments. You can do full SQL installations. So you could take a template and build basically a SQL template with a sysprepped SQL installation. It's a special installation of SQL. And then you can layer your configuration for SQL on top of it as it's deployed. And that, no, this is all inside of VMM. Just VMM. Just VMM. Yeah, not stretching outside of VMM. So there's some cool capabilities in there. And the library actually has a lot of functionality. Here's a for instance. There's stuff that's buried in there that you have to kind of dig in to find. Anybody see a thing called equivalent objects in VMM, in the library? It's this little blue icon that says equivalent objects, and for the longest time I had no idea what it did. So the library are just file servers, and the idea is if I have Hyper-V infrastructure over here and Hyper-V infrastructure in another site, I can put a library server in each site, and then when I want to deploy stuff to them, I deploy locally. I don't have to go across the wire to do it. You can replicate all that stuff with DFSR. Works great. So you just set up a DFSR replication point between the two, stuff all your things in one server, it'll replicate everything and keep it all in sync for you. The equivalent objects is now when you look in VMM, you'll see 2 copies of the VHD, one on each server. Well, you can select both of them, mark them as equivalent, and then when there's a template that gets deployed, it doesn't have to worry about where the file's coming from for the template, because it will say, this group of servers is associated with library server A. This group of servers is associated with library server B. These files are marked as equivalent objects. So when I go to deploy a template and it's marked with a VHD from this file server, but I go to push it over here, it'll go, oh, I have an equivalent object here, I'll just deploy it locally and push it out. So there's a lot of cool things that are kind of buried in there that aren't necessarily as easy to understand what they are. Some neat things. And a lot of that stuff actually came from Microsoft's cloud experience. You have to remember that they've been managing Azure now for years. And that's given them a lot of knowledge and kind of like rubber meets the road stuff. That's helped to trickle into the product. So there's a lot of stuff that's in there. They do bare metal provisioning. We haven't set this up for anybody because it's a little bit convoluted, but the promise is rack a box in, turn it on, it pixie boots off the network, dumps an image on it, brings it into the Hyper-V environment, installs Hyper-V, adds it to the cluster, and boom, you have new servers in your environment.
In the cluster too?
In the cluster. You can orchestrate all the clustering part of it too. Yeah, so it's pretty cool. But it's not easy to set up. They do some very cool IP address management. They have cloud integration directly into Azure, which is technically part of App Controller. But I lump App Controller and VMM together because it's just a self-service portal. Storage, live migration, dynamic optimization. By the way, DO is a function of only of VMM. Most of the stuff you saw in the previous slides were stuff you get out of the box with Hyper-V. This is one of the few things that you actually have to have VMM to take advantage of. Just like you need vCenter to get DRS, you need VMM to get this. Storage management, integration with load balancers. They've done a lot of interesting things to start to tie together other parts of your infrastructure together. So you could have the SAN team kind of give you access into the SAN's raw information. You get the logins. And you can actually provision LUNs through the VMM interface on the fly.
Speaking to that, in the free versions of both, is Microsoft kind of giving you more with their free version than ESX is with theirs?
Yeah, from a Hyper-V perspective, there is no neutering of functionality. Everything is available to you. The only thing that you get, the only limitation you have in the free version is that you are stuck in core, and you can't load any other roles on the server. So it's core only. But you get live migration, storage live migration, clustering, HA, VMs, a lot of the things that you see here, like library management, bare metal provisioning, IP address, IPAM can be done sort of in Windows Server, but not to the same thing. Dynamic optimization, integration with load balancers, that stuff is restricted to the management platform. But all the stuff all those bullets, those capabilities you saw in there, doesn't matter whether you're running the free version or not. Hyper-V doesn't cost anything. And I've had that argument with a lot of different people at different levels. The reality of it is Hyper-V has no cost to it, because as soon as you license one guest to run on that system, you've licensed the host, the hypervisor. So I don't care what you're running, unless you're exclusively a Linux platform, and you're only running Linux VMs and you have no need for Windows, I'd question why you're looking at Windows as your hypervisor in the first place. But the reality is, as soon as you license it, you need to be, you're going to own Hyper-V. So it doesn't matter what, that's why Microsoft looks at it and goes, I don't care if it's the free version or not. The only thing you're losing is the GUI. And most of the production installs we do are core anyway. So one of the cool things about 2012, incidentally, is that you can start its life as a GUI installation and get it up and running. And then with a reboot, you can flip it into core. They even have a minimal interface mode, which gets Explorer out of there, IE out of there, most of the stuff, but still gives you Server Manager and some GUI capabilities in there. But you could go core, total core if you want. And you can flip it back. With another reboot, you can flip the GUI back in. So System Center. Who here uses any part of System Center in their environment? What are the big ones? SCOM, SCCM, probably the two main ones. Anybody using DPM? Yeah, I didn't think so. Service Manager? I found one customer that's using Service Manager down in DC. VMM, obviously, if you're using Hyper-V, probably using that. They did something in 2012, and VMware picked up on this because they jacked the price of System Center up, but what they did is they said, it's all one piece. It's one SKU, that's it. You don't buy SCOM anymore, you don't buy Config Manager anymore, you buy one thing. And each of these tools does a piece of the management puzzle. Virtual Machine Manager is all about managing virtual assets and the hosts that ride on those, and the pieces that make up your virtual infrastructure. Config Manager is about operating system application deployment, maintenance, care and feeding, configuration management. Operations Manager, performance, health, alerting, SLAs, those kinds of things. They don't cross over one another for the most part. So each one of these tools is meant to manage a piece of the infrastructure. But the interesting thing that you have is Config Manager, Ops Manager, DPM, they work across physical and virtual environments. So I was always a proponent of that idea. Why in the VMware world do I have to use vCops to manage my virtual infrastructure performance, but then have to find something else to manage what's going on at the physical level outside of my virtual world? And that was logical for a lot of people because virtualization was sandboxed in the infrastructure to a certain number of people, and they just managed their thing, and guys that managed the other part of the performance was a different set of people. Then you end up with all these disparate tools. So it'd be cool to have one set of tools. Rick?
Seems like especially with the coming R2 releases that VMM is starting to take a lot bigger central role. Like you mentioned, the automatic provisioning of Hyper-V machines, provision scale-out file servers as well now.
Yep.
There seems to be a lot more collapsing down
Into VMM? Yeah, so what Rick said was, it seems like VMM in the newest release that's coming is starting to really have more of a stake in the management, like scale-out file clusters and things like that. And it's because virtualization is spreading. They kind of look at that and go, well, Microsoft is touting use scale-out file clusters for virtualization, so you should be able to deploy those through VMM. But you're starting to get some more crossover between the tools. And that really started in the first version of 2012 because they put dynamic optimization in there. They allowed you to patch your hosts and your library assets directly from VMM instead of having to use a separate WSUS infrastructure or config manager. They kind of started to put things in there. You could do your cluster management for Hyper-V right in VMM. You don't have to go out to the tool, which, thank God, I had a hard time explaining that to people, why you had 18 panes of glass to go through to get to this thing. So, yeah, but we haven't seen, are you using scale file clusters? You having good luck with them?
Yes and no.
That's kind of what we've seen.
Had some challenges with
The
R2 release.
R2 release. Yeah, we've seen LUNs drop. We've seen just weird things happen with it. I think R2 is going to bring stability to it, hopefully.
CSV caching is awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. But basically, each one of these tools does something different. But when we talk about kind of like, I'm going to hit pricing, and you guys can say, wash over that. I don't care about that. We'll go past it. But basically what they did is they lumped everything into one price. You get all of it. And one of the cool things that they did add in it was this piece, which a lot of people don't know. All your SQL rights to run any of these tools are all included in the licensing. You don't have to buy SQL separately for this stuff. So when you buy your System Center licenses, you're good to go. You can stand up whatever SQL you need to run it. That's kind of like what a big picture architecture looks like with all the pieces in place. There's a couple of different self-service portals. The lower one here is App Controller, which is the one we see a lot of people using. The top one up there is actually from Service Manager, which gives you more capabilities and more flexibility, but it's a complete blank slate when you build it. It's kind of like, okay, now it's here. You tell me what you want it to look like and what you want to build, what fields you want, where they got to go, what you do with the fields afterwards. So there's a lot of pieces that get tied together. Microsoft has this cloud process optimization pack, which ties into Orchestrator and Service Manager, so that when you have a form that you build about, I want to build a VM with 4 CPUs and I want to be able to type in I want 4 gigs of RAM and do all these different things, Orchestrator will pick up those values in Service Manager and then go talk to VMM to build that system for you. Some of those Orchestrator packs are already been built for you. Other ones you just have to expand on. Anybody using any of the cloud features in 2012? Aside from, building a cloud and having it just be this bucket of stuff that's sitting there. Man, I don't think we have enough time.
SCBMM has cloud stuff, but I mean, what does that mean really?
So, I'm convinced that there's a board of people that meet every 3 or 4 years and just come up with some term to mess everybody up. Yeah, cloud is whatever. Cloud is what you need it to be. There's a lot of definitions of cloud. There's actually more prereqs for cloud than there are solution itself. But when I say that, I mean, are you tying things together with doing a lot of self-service and automation behind the scenes and being able to deploy systems through requests and approvals and kind of like the marketing speak of cloud? Using any of those pieces in there? Anybody use? Yep. Yeah, they're assigning costs and things. We see more show back than actual chargeback, just because financial systems aren't equipped to deal with it.
Isn't Orchestrator supposed to do that automation process sort of like glue? I'm asking a question.
Yeah,
But it seems to me like it's supposed to glue all these system center pieces together.
it does. Yeah, and it's actually confusing because when you look at this, there's another drawing of this that kind of draws it as a circle with all the pieces peppered around it. And they stuff Service Manager in the middle of it because this is where the lines blur between what does what and what does the other things. Service Manager is kind of cool. Nobody really uses it because the first thing they look at that and goes, oh, I have to pitch Remedy to use this thing. So it's not a popular conversation to have with somebody. But one of the things that Service Manager does really well is it ties into all the other System Center pieces. So the Config Manager managing your systems, that piece of the puzzle understands what's installed on there, the applications, the configuration state, when it was built, what OS it is, what version, when it was patched, all that stuff is already sitting in the Config Manager database. Ops Manager has all the information about the performance history and the health and the current SLAs and what's going on now and what happened a week ago. What you can do is when you tie these things together in Service Manager, when you open up a ticket on an object that's in the inventory, it just sucks this information together from these other databases and shows you a picture of everything that's happening with that system. All the patches that happened, all the dates that those occurred, all the performance history, and you can start to see some things, some correlation in there. But again, it's not a big product that people are using, but you can use something like that and then have Orchestrator plugged under the covers that's tied into all those System Center pieces to take information out of one system and move it along to another system and do something with it. Orchestrator is one of those things that I think everybody in this room should use because it's a phenomenal tool, and it's a very simple, easy tool to start using because a lot of the integration packs are there, and the ones that aren't there you can usually substitute with either an open API or PowerShell or something else that's in there. Steve? I'd build an apartment for the people that are going to be required to do it. I said I'd build an apartment for the people required to do it. You start with the core things I think for the virtualization end of the world are VMM, obviously, SCOM, because you need to know what's going on performance-wise, you need to history trend it, and Orchestrator. Because Orchestrator will glue it into everything else that you're doing in your environment. If you have Remedy, Orchestrator will tie it in. If you have HP Service Manager, it'll tie that in. If you're using HP Config Manager for some reason for doing things, it'll tie that in. So that's kind of like the 3 pieces that are top. And I lump App Controller in there as well because it's a self-service portal. It's a really easy thing to use. And then if you're using Config Manager already, that's cool. DPM is usually DPM and Service Manager are the last pieces we look to graft into an environment because they're big conversations to have. And there's probably a good chance that you already have something that's just as good and works fine. There's no need to go and do a lift and replace. Monolithic versus a microkernel. I threw this in here because this is always an interesting conversation to have. I actually consider this more like a religious conversation, because VMware will tout that, well, we're a tighter, simpler hypervisor because we don't put anything in there. Everything is contained in our hypervisor. We manage the whole thing from the software level. We manage all the drivers that are going into that environment. Everything lives in the hypervisor. Why would you want a big fat operating system hanging over top of that? Microsoft looks at that and says, well, our operating system is awesome. It does all these great things, and this architecture has been used in many different platforms besides Hyper-V. The Zen platforms use a very similar one. I have my drivers up in a generalized operating system partition, which now allows me to insert new drivers without affecting the hypervisor layer. And what's wrong with that? The reality of it is I don't think anybody cares. One of the things that VMware still touts to this day is the size of their hypervisor. Why do you want a big general purpose operating system doing your hypervisor when we have this small little specifically built cool thing? And I would argue, who cares? I'm talking about disk space. Patching, totally irrelevant. Because if I have to patch a system and reboot it, it doesn't matter whether I'm applying 1 patch or 20 patches. I'm still taking the system offline for some reason. And I build my infrastructure and I scale it so that I can deal with that. So, I look at this in terms of a religious argument. I could care less, really, between these. They'll say, well, if you pop this partition with a blue screen, your whole system dies. Sure. Technically, if I killed my small little BSD partition that's living in the ESX server, I would accomplish the exact same thing, because even if I can't manage it and touch it, it's great that the VMs are running, but I can't do anything to the box anyway. Who cares? Reality of it is you treat Hyper-V as a black box. 2012 is a very stable operating system. We're just not seeing blue screens these days, as long as you don't start inserting third-party drivers and things into there. Stick with what's signed, stick with what's been tested, and you shouldn't have any issues. Any questions on that? Comments, concerns? I look at that as an irrelevant conversation these days. So what about density and performance? So if you look at any of the marketing that comes from either VMware or from Microsoft, mostly from the VMware side, they'll say, well, if you look at our cost comparisons, you'll get a lot more density out of our environment because of all the memory capabilities that we do. So how do the memory management capabilities differ between these? You guys familiar with the dynamic memory? Who's familiar with dynamic memory? Who likes dynamic memory? I love dynamic memory. As long as you know how to use it and when to use it, which is most of the time, there's a few things you have to be sensitive of. Essentially, you have two schools of thought. VMware is, I have an amount of memory, I allocate what I think I need to a VM, and the hypervisor on the back end will determine what I can scrape back and use for somebody else. Hyper-V's perspective is, I have a bucket of memory that I will just establish some parameters around what I need at the beginning and what I need to grow to at some point, and let the hypervisor manage what gets influxed into the VM at runtime. They both work really, really well. The magic that VMware did in their memory management is phenomenal. It's unbelievable. But they've run into some bumps along the way. Halem came out, kind of goofed things up with their architecture a little bit, and they had to retool a little bit to get some savings back out of it. But essentially, you get the same kind of memory capabilities. On the VMware side, you get some freedom where you can be like, I'll give it 64 gigs of RAM and I'll let VMware manage it behind the scenes, even though I know I don't need it. In the Hyper-V world, you can't just give it 64 gigs of RAM. You can let it grow up to 64 gigs. And thank God in 2012, they actually, in Task Manager, have the visibility of dynamic memory in there. So you can see that the VM's using 2 gigs, but there's a thing that says it's got up to 64 gigs of RAM in it. So your business users won't complain to you. But the reality of it is you have to take some responsibility for understanding what the workload needs. And I've been touting this for years. I think the idea of just assigning VMs X amount of memory because that's our standard is a poor practice. When you're trying to manage your workloads, you really need to understand what the workload needs and consumes and how the patterns of that consumption change over time, and then manage to that. Steve. Great question. So the question is, when you're using Microsoft Dynamic Memory, what does the OS think that it has? Prior to 2012, the OS would think whatever it had at that moment. So when you use a dynamic memory, you start with a bunch of parameters in here. So you have your startup RAM, which is when the system boots and the BIOS initiates, that's what it sees. And it comes up. Then you have a couple of parameters that you can tune. You can go down, you can actually drift down below your static amount of memory, or you can burst up to your maximum. What will happen is the system will see initially the startup RAM, and it will always see the startup RAM in the system. If it happens to go above, so you start to, other processes and applications start to load, the buffer comes into play because it says whatever I need plus the buffer must be, the amount of memory or less that I have. So what will happen is, let's say that gets bumped to 1225. When you look in Task Manager, you'll see 1225. And you'll always see 1225 until you power cycle that VM. Even though when you look in Hyper-V at the counters behind the scenes, it's only using 500 megs now at this point. The rest has been made available to the hypervisor elsewhere. What's cool though in 2012 is that you'll still see that, but there's actually an indicator for the maximum RAM. So if you set the maximum to 64 gigs and you look in Task Manager, it'll actually have a number that says maximum RAM 64 gigs. So it's nice that they expose that. What was it? It's hot add, not hot remove. Yeah. And it's not administrative hot add. It's hypervisor hot add.
So you're saying once you boot it up and use some of the memory, that's now assigned to the VM until you reboot? No, it takes it back.
It will take it back. There's a ballooning mechanism there, but it's not, the ballooning doesn't work the way VMware does. VMware puts a driver in the VM that puts pressure on the VM to determine what it needs. The hypervisor actually controls the ballooning capabilities to say, oh, you don't need that. I can reuse that memory for somewhere else.
But the OS is still recording it and then available to pull it back. I'm getting confused, but Task Manager is still showing.
Yeah. There is and there's a direct communication channel between the guest and the hypervisor that are completely in lockstep around what's happening with dynamic memory. So you won't run into a situation where the hypervisor is doing something with memory and the guest doesn't know about it. The guest will always understand what it has really access to, which is why you need the integration services. The guest will give it, the hypervisor will take it back because the hypervisor knows what the working set in the physical memory of the box is. And if it sees I gave you, a gig and you're only using 512, I can take some of that back to use elsewhere.
So, isn't that saying though that 2012 works better for dynamic memory with Hyper-V than VMware because of that guest hypervisor channel that's always established? Or because the operating system is built to understand the dynamic memory in Hyper-V to begin with?
It's a great point, and I would probably argue that I'm not sold on that. But the logic you're following there that it would be better is there because you do have you've got logic that understands between the guest and the host, which you don't have in VMware. You have a channel there that the ESX hypervisor can talk to the guest tools for certain things, but at the operating system kernel level, you actually have some communication that's happening there about what's happening in the OS. So you get an upper hand there. But because of that, you are restricted to what supports that and what level you support that at. So for instance, you can't, certain service packs are required to get the right integration services on there to take advantage of those features in Windows. And Linux today doesn't support dynamic memory because there's no capability in it. That's changing in R2, where they're going to have the dynamic memory drivers in Linux, so you can take advantage of that.
All our VMs are 2008 R2 right now. We don't actually use, I experimented with 2012 Hyper-V, just trying to figure out how to move forward. How much of this dynamic memory, I've never used that either, just 2008 R2 VMs, can they use this?
They can. What you need to do is if you put a 2008 R2 VM on a 2012 hypervisor, then you have to upgrade the integration services in the VM. That's it. Then it'll take advantage of the capabilities. Yeah. There is some stuff that's coming in R2 that will be restricted only to modern operating systems because there's kernel level hooks that are required in the guest. And you won't be able to get those just with an integration services bump. So, but no, for dynamic memory, yeah, it's just an integration services change.
That's a good question. How far does it go back?
How far does it go back?
What's the oldest OS that can be able to run
Dynamic memory, 2003 R2 SP2. Yeah.
A couple of those still too, so.
Yeah, that's the latest that you can get the tools on. I don't know if that may change with the R2 release, because they do start to filter it off, and you have to remember that 2008 or 2003 OS has only got less than a year's worth of life in it.
Well, on this, when you go to install SCVMM 2012 Server Spec 1, I had mine set for startup of 1 gig, and then did the dynamic memory from 1 gig to 8 gig, and it wouldn't install because it said, nope, I need 4 gig.
Correct, because the OS had no demand to drive the number up, and you require at least 2 gigs, and you'll get the warning flag at 2, you'll get everything's good at 4, but unless the OS demands more memory, it won't have more memory, so your prereq checker was failing on that.
At 4 gig in
Yep.
order to get to.
And VMM needs a lot of memory these days. It's a hog. I mean, 8 gigs minimum, 16 probably preferential in a production environment. It's a pig. Most of the System Center products are pretty pig-like.
So you mentioned before about VMware and removing it. I know that does a lot of hard drive caching. You hit your limits. Is there anything that Microsoft does that's similar to that, or no?
How so? When you say hard drive caching?
So let's say if I have a system and it doesn't have any available memory, I'm going to start looking.
Oh, the swap.
Exactly.
In Hyper-V, nothing gets swapped. All the memory assigned to virtual machines is part of the non-paged pool, which means the hypervisor cannot page it to disk. This was one of the limitations that Hyper-V had, because prior to dynamic memory, if you gave a system 8 gigs of RAM, when you turned that system on, 8 gigs disappeared from the box, and you could only turn on the amount of VMs that you had the RAM to stuff in. Now with dynamic memory, you've got a little bit of room there, because you could say the maximum is 8 gigs, but I think it's only going to need 2, so I'll set the load numbers at 2. You can get more systems on there. The reality is that, again, this goes back to know your workload, because you have to know what the system needs. Just say, oh, I'll give it 8 because I don't really have any idea. That's cool, but then you use SCOM to trend and watch that system and understand what it needs, and then you tune your parameters accordingly to manage the amount of memory that's required on it.
So if you over-provision and you have contention, what happens?
If you over-provision and you have contention, it depends. If you run out of memory, you can't power on a VM. You go to turn it on and it will say, I don't have enough memory to do this, you can't do it. If you are really close, one of the things they did in 2012, and this kind of like violates what I just said a second ago, they did build a swap parameter into Hyper-V 2012. Help me out. What do they call that? Do you remember? Dynamic paging? I think it's dynamic page file, dynamic paging. Essentially what it is it's meant to make up the gap between this and this temporarily when the cluster is trying to recover from a failed server. So picture this. I have 8 servers in my cluster. I'm kind of running really lean at this point with memory. I'm up in the high 80s, low 90s on the RAM. I have a server that blows up. The cluster wants to power all those virtual machines on other hosts, but memory's tight. So what it will do is it will very temporarily take the difference between those two numbers on a VM by VM basis and swap it to disk temporarily to get those systems turned on, and then it'll immediately release those swap files. So all it is it's kind of like push everybody aside, cram more people into the bus, and then let them kind of exhale and get to the point where they're at least, I can breathe, but I can't move. But cool, and the whole purpose of that technology that they wrote into there was to just cover an availability nuance of I'm close, I can run within this tight parameter, but I can't power them on because Hyper-V's giving me a violation that there's not enough memory. It's just a way to kind of like push things aside, get them up and running, and then return to normal. It's not meant to push the boundaries on things. Okay, cost comparisons. Anybody care about this? You want to go through this? Yeah. How much time do I have? I'll go through it quick. Yeah. This is the Server 2012 editions. There's actually 5 here. There's only 3 that you ever have to worry about because the bottom 2, non-existent. Essentials is just like the real bare bones. It was meant to, I think it was meant to kind of replace the home edition that they had out there for a while. But Foundation is an OEM only. These have very low user count limits. They have no virtualization rights. You cannot run Hyper-V on them, so ignore them. You have Data Center Standard and Hyper-V version, which is the free downloadable version of that. The difference between Data Center and Standard is the virtualization rights. There's no feature differences in 2012 anymore. 2008 used to have things where it's like, I need enterprise because I want clustering, and none of that stuff. It's all the same feature sets. All it is based around virtualization rights at this point. Both licensed by the number of physical sockets in the box, and they need CALs, and the little asterisk means that's for file and print only. When you build VMs, there's no charge for the VMs that you're going to build on a hypervisor. You need to license the Windows OS itself, but you don't need Hyper-V CALs or anything like that. And the costs are listed at retail, the open levels for data center per processor for the server edition. Who's running data center edition? So, do I have a thing in here on this? It kind of applies to this. It's the same thing. Let me skip to this real quick and I'll ask the question then. So the difference between standard and data center is the virtualization rights. In standard edition, you buy the number of licenses you need by the physical processors in your server. So DL380, I need 2 because I have 2 sockets. I could have 10 cores per socket, that's cool. 2 sockets for each one. My virtualization rights on standard gives me the right to run 2 guests, and that's it. On data center, I can run as many guests as I can stuff in the box on that. It's the only difference between the two. Look at these two in terms of data center is for virtual, standard is for physical servers. I'm going to build a physical SCCM server. I would buy a standard license for that. I wouldn't buy a data center license for that because it's just going to be a box. And you have cost differences between the two right there. Cool on that? Who's running data center on the, Steve? Licensing is exactly the same. That's what's on this slide here. Yeah, I'll hit that in 1 second. I just want to stick on the Windows licensing for 1 minute. Who here is running VMware? Who's running data? Who's not running data center? Are you running VMware? Do you use vMotion or DRS? You need to be on data center. It is almost impossible to license an environment with standard edition or with, on the 2008 side, enterprise and standard, and stay in compliance. Because the way the licensing, the EULA is written, when you move a system, a VM, from one host to another, the EULA is tied to the physical box it's on, not to the guest. So if I move it from here to here, that's considered a license transfer. I can only move that license once every 90 days and be in compliance. If I've got stuff moving around my environment, I need data center because data center has an unlimited number of guests and there's always a license on the destination server you're moving it to and you can move things around. So that's one of the...
You need 2 data center licenses.
You need 2 data center licenses for 2 hosts because data center is licensed for 2 sockets. Yeah.
The good news is if you're a nonprofit, you get it for $286 a pop, not full-time.
Yes. The prices are way cheaper than what you see up here. This is a retail. So System Center licensing is the same way. Standard and Data Center Edition. It's the number of licenses, and this is based around, this is virtualization rights. Management licenses, OS environments for the management licenses. If you buy Data Center Edition of System Center, it's unlimited. You can manage every VM on there with every System Center tool that you have. If you buy Standard, then you get only the 2 rights, and that's the costs on them. And these are retail costs. They include SQL use rights. They include all the tools that are up there, all the good stuff. It's kind of nice because it's simple, but the price did jack up a little bit on System Center as a result.
Have you done much use with SPLA licensing for providers?
No, not yet. No, it's kind of complicated, and I haven't really gotten into it.
And actually, at Microsoft, you did what things are too.
Yeah.
What if you were a legacy SCCM customer, right, and that was the only issue you saw, now it's a single license, how would that handle that? EA had a whole EA agreement. What are they doing with that license?
There was an entitlement process that happened. If you didn't already latch onto that, you're kind of going to have to go back to the drawing board with them. Then you have to talk to your rep. There are entitlements to get you from the old up to the new. Yeah, there's step-up licenses. Yeah. So here's a cost comparison. I'm going to skip past this because we're going to start to run tight on time and I want to get to the ugly. We do a lot of these cost comparisons for customers. 1,150 ESX hosts, 2,300 sockets. They were running vSphere 5 Enterprise Plus licensing at 42% off list. This was their real cost that they paid VMware. This was their real cost for the Microsoft side, $1,747 per 2-socket System Center license. I do not have Windows licensing in here because, one, these particular individuals were already licensed for Data Center Edition, and two, if you're running VMware and you're looking at converting, you're already running Windows on your guests, you should already be licensed for Windows. I kind of look at that as an irrelevant factor, and that's why I said there's really no cost for the hypervisor, because you're already licensing your guests. As soon as you license the first guest on a host, the host is licensed. It's just the way the licensing works. So here's the cost. Total spend for 3 years. This is a little bit false because, yes, the number is jacked way up there on the VMware side, but the blue section that you see there is money already spent. So we do show this to show total spend cost differences, and there's a pretty significant one. But the reality of it is, if I'm going to switch to Hyper-V, I would pay both of these, but I've already paid for the blue. I just really am looking at the next 3 years on the maintenance. So this is probably more accurate between the two. This is for the maintenance of 3 years of the Hyper-V environment. This is for the VMware environment. This is build new Hyper-V and then maintain it for the next 3 years. Pretty close, but the interesting thing about this is about, I think this is about 82, 83% of this number. So the thing that we show people is you're going to care and feed for your VMware environment for 3 years. It'll still cost you less to replace it. And these are using real, this was the client's actual number. So this isn't, we're looking at density is the same, managing your memory, all that kind of stuff. And then when you look at just maintenance, ongoing care and feeding, VMware's maintenance costs are astronomical. So you guys will have this deck, and if you guys want to chat about these things, I'll skip through that. Point behind this was, a lot of the top features that people are using virtualization for haven't changed over the years. It's still a lot of the same kinds of things. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. Couple things that haven't really made it, and it's funny, these seem to stay on the board over and over again. You can't hot add CPU and memory. Memory can be added dynamically through dynamic memory, but you can't, as an administrator, go in there and pop more memory in. You can't hot add or remove networking, which still puzzles me to this day because I still remember sitting in a room watching a demo with Microsoft hot adding a NIC to a VM prior to the first release of Hyper-V. Still hasn't made it. And there's no VM fault tolerance, but those are about the only big ones that we see. And I don't really see a use for FT. VMware fault tolerance, the feature from VMware, where you're actually mirroring the memory state across two ESX servers. So they have the ability to take a VM and say, I want to mirror this VM on a different host. So in case I lose the VM, it's instantly on. It's different. Hyper-V Replica is moving the VM to another one, and I can administratively decide I'm going to turn it on the other side.
There's no live state.
It's a live state of the VM. Or it's a disk state of the VM replication. VMFT is a live transfer of the contents of memory. It's like a constant vMotion. If this host were to die for some reason, that VM is instantly on and available. It's like clustering, but the difference is that you're doing it at the host hardware level, and the reality of it is something's going to go wrong with a box, and you need that level of redundancy. You probably need clustering at the application level, not redundancy at that level in the hardware. Plus, VMware FT has so many restrictions. I mean, single CPU only, no vMotion, no keep, all that kind of stuff kind of washes out.
How often is it the host crashes, crash both?
Yeah.
Or not host, I'm sorry, the VMs themselves, if you're having a problem with that VM. That problem is replicated.
It actually works. And I haven't tried that, but I read that, and I was like, that's pretty slick.
The other thing, I don't know if you can confirm or deny, but what I understand, VMMR2 does not actually have PUD built into it. Their storage.
I haven't seen it, so I don't know, but that could be because they have an independent tool that they develop now to do that. Yeah. I don't know if it may not be built in.
Do you have any experience with SANless, like a cluster in a box, server, or box with a couple of server nodes and local storage? You build, like a 4-node cluster in one box.
Oh yeah, talk to me about that. I can give you some insight into what we did. We've done that. Yep. Cool. All right, cool. Thanks guys, appreciate it. Anybody wants any other information, let me know.